I'd like to welcome those who are now joining our meeting online. I can see a number of people have now joined the call, others are slowly coming in. Just as we wait for everyone to join, we will begin soon. If you can just let us know in the chat where you're from, where you're tuning in from, either where you're tuning in from in New Zealand, in Australia, or even internationally. Let us know in the chat below. Just make sure you click on the option to send to everybody. But as you're coming in, just welcome to our meeting today and let us know where you're tuning in from. I can already see some coming through from Adelaide and Sydney, Nelson, New Zealand, Geelong. We've got numbers coming in now, Melbourne, Kapiti, western suburbs of Melbourne, Brisbane. Got people from South New Zealand, from Central Coast in Australia. We have some from Hamilton, New Zealand. Much welcome everybody from both, Wellington, from those from both New Zealand and Australia. We do have numbers across each country, which is important. Another one from Newcastle. Okay, well, we'll begin the meeting now. I would like to welcome all in attendance to the meeting of the Socialist Equality Group entitled After the Strike by More Than 100,000 Workers in New Zealand, the Way Forward in the Fight Against Austerity and War. My name is Max Boddy and I'll be chairing the meeting today. We are convening this meeting to address the way forward in the wake of the historic public sector strike on the 23rd of October. On that day, 100,000 workers across New Zealand took part in the largest industrial action since 1979. This included approximately 60,000 teachers, more than 30,000 nurses, 5,000 doctors, and around 20,000 other healthcare workers. And additionally, another 2,000 firefighters staged a nationwide one-hour strike on October 17th. This mass movement was directed against the National Party-led coalition government's austerity drive, which includes real wage cuts, the ongoing hiring freeze in public hospitals, the deepening crisis in public education, and the broader dismantling of social services. Representing roughly 3.5% of the entire New Zealand workforce, the strike was the largest industrial action in the country in nearly half a century. But its significance goes beyond numbers. The strike drew wide support from across society. A nationwide poll showed that 65% of the population supported the strike and only 25% were opposed. This expresses a basic fact. The crisis in the public sector is not confined to one group of workers. In every industry, people are confronting rising prices, declining real wages, understaffing, and the deterioration of social services that millions rely on. In this meeting, we will discuss the way forward. We have two speakers today who will go into depth on the international context and the political perspective necessary for the working class to advance its interests. I will introduce them shortly, but I want to begin by situating the strike in New Zealand within the broader global crisis. Now, the eruption of the October 23rd strike was itself a part of an international upsurge of working class struggles. The same conditions driving New Zealand workers into struggle are present in every country. In the United States, just days prior to October 23rd, 7 million people took part in the No Kings protest, the largest demonstrations in that country's history, opposing the Trump administration's efforts to concentrate power in the presidency and establish a form of authoritarian rule. In France, again, just days before, hundreds of thousands mobilized against sweeping attacks on pensions, healthcare, and social rights. And in Italy, millions joined strikes and mass protests against the US-Israeli genocide in Gaza and the reactionary far-right program of the Meloni government. At the center of this global crisis is a historically unprecedented concentration of wealth. A tiny layer of billionaires now controls vast resources, while tens of millions of people struggle to afford food, housing, and healthcare. Now, the most extreme expression of this inequality can be seen in the position of Elon Musk, whose compensation package from Tesla amounts to more than $1 trillion over 10 years. On a yearly basis, this translates into roughly $50 million per hour, that is United States dollars. That is estimated to be around 3 million times the starting wage of a Tesla factory worker, which is approximately $18 an hour. This single fact captures the reality of the global situation. Society is being organized entirely in the interests of a tiny oligarchy. The wealth produced by workers everywhere is siphoned upwards, while governments slash public services and prepare for war. This is the significance of the developments now taking place inside the United States. The turn towards dictatorship is not a matter of Trump's personal character. It arises from the fundamental crisis of the capitalist system. The enormous wealth now accumulated into the hands of a tiny financial and corporate elite is occurring at the same time and is the result of the destruction of vast majority of people's living standards. And it's under these conditions the maintenance of this social order increasingly comes into conflict with democratic forms of rule. The interests of the oligarchy cannot be reconciled with the democratic rights and basic needs of the population. To enforce mass austerity and prepare for major war, the ruling class requires authoritarian methods of rule. The Trump administration is seeking to free the presidency from all meaningful legal constraints. The Supreme Court ruling granted the presidency immunity for official acts officially and effectively places the executive above the law. This forms the legal foundation for authoritarian rule. Alongside this, Trump's advisors and layers of the state bureaucracy are developing concrete plans to reorganize the federal government while purging tens of thousands of public servants. These same plans include the use of military to suppress domestic unrest, mass deportations to intimidate and divide the working class, and the criminalization of strikes and political opposition. In other words, the machinery of the state is being reshaped to ensure that the needs of the oligarchy can be enforced through repression. Now, the struggle of workers in New Zealand is inseparable from these international processes. The fight against austerity, inequality, and war is a global fight, and it requires the unification of the working class across borders. So today, to discuss these critical lessons, I am happy to introduce our first speaker for this meeting, Tom Peters. Tom has been a regular writer for the World Socialist website since 2008 and leads the work of the Socialist Equality Group in New Zealand. He is the author of Pike River, The Crime and Cover-Up, and, in addition, regularly covers New Zealand politics, workers' struggles, the fight against war, the COVID-19 pandemic, and many historical and cultural issues on the website. So with that, I'd like to welcome Tom to this meeting.
Thank you, Max. As Max has already said, the strike movement here by more than 100,000 workers on October 23rd was an historic event, both for New Zealand and internationally. It is part of the re-emerging class struggle that we're seeing in country after country, driven by the deepening crisis of the global capitalist system. The center of this crisis is in the United States, and to place the events in New Zealand within their proper context, it is necessary to make a few points about what is happening in the US, where millions of people are protesting against the efforts of the Trump administration to establish a fascist dictatorship. At the root of that crisis is the astronomical wealth built up by a handful of billionaires and unprecedented levels of social inequality. And as you can see, this week, the Oxfam charity reported that since 2020, the wealth of the 10 richest men in America has increased sixfold, so over a 5-year period. And Elon Musk, the world's richest man, increased his personal wealth since the pandemic uh, from $33 billion to $469 billion, a 14-fold increase. To maintain this vast wealth and the American position as the world's dominant power requires a brutal assault on the working class within the United States and imperialist war against US rivals. President Donald Trump is using the government shutdown to unleash a policy of forced hunger by slashing food stamp benefits for 42 million people. That is part of a strategy to drastically increase the exploitation of the working class, reduce life expectancy, and destroy whatever remains of public health care and social programs. Meanwhile, unprecedented sums are being channeled towards militarism, nearly $1 trillion last year. The US-backed Israeli genocide in Gaza, which began under the Biden administration, is one part of a global war aimed at nothing less than redividing the entire world in the interests of US imperialism and its allies. And that includes the ongoing US-NATO war against Russia over Ukraine, as well as the bombing of Iran and Yemen, the warmongering against Venezuela, and most importantly, the far advanced plans for war against China, America's main economic rival. The agenda of war and destruction abroad and class war at home cannot be implemented democratically. The reign of terror that's been unleashed against immigrants is the spearhead of a full-scale assault on the democratic rights of all workers within the US. As we explained in the introduction to a recently published book, The Rise of Trump and the Crisis of American Democracy, Trump is a symptom of a decayed and diseased social order. He embodies the criminality of the American working class, ruling class as a whole, and therefore the struggle against dictatorship and war must be a fight against capitalism itself. This analysis stresses that the fight against Trump cannot be waged through appeals to the Democratic Party, which has paved the way for his return at every stage. All of his anti-democratic attacks have been prepared by the Biden administration and also the Obama administration before that, which pioneered the use of targeted drone assassinations, as well as the militarization of the police, indefinite imprisonment for whistleblowers, mass deportations, and mass surveillance of the population. Trump's agenda is encountering mass opposition and resistance, but what is necessary is a movement of the working class, completely independent of the Democrats and against the capitalist system which created Trump. While the political crisis is most advanced in the United States, all of the same basic processes, the destruction of social programs and democratic rights, the militarization of society, all of those processes are underway in New Zealand as they are in Australia, Britain, France, Germany, Japan, India, and indeed every country. Here, the National Party-led government, with two widely hated far-right parties, ACT and New Zealand First, playing a leading role, is leading a brutal assault on workers' living conditions. New Zealand First leader Winston Peters, in particular, is seeking to imitate Donald Trump in scapegoating immigrants for the crisis and also demonizing and railing against Marxism and socialism at every opportunity. Meanwhile, to come to the recent strike, teachers, nurses, doctors, and other healthcare professionals, as well as firefighters, have all been offered a pay rise of about 2% or even less per year, which amounts to a substantial pay cut. Inflation is at 3%, but the real cost of living is far higher. Food prices have increased by 4.1%, power prices by more than 11%, and visiting a doctor has gone up by more than 10%. The government's aim is to set a benchmark for driving down wages and ramping up the exploitation of all workers. It is intensifying the austerity policies that were already underway during the last Labour government, which starved healthcare and education of resources, leading to a staffing crisis in hospitals and schools. This is being done partly to free up money for more tax cuts for the rich, including landlords and property speculators. And there's a direct connection between the cuts to wages and public services and the government's decision, fully backed by the Labour Party, to double the Defence Force budget from 1% to 2% of GDP. $13 billion is being spent on new warplanes, Navy vessels, and other equipment over the next 4 years. And this is only the beginning, as the government has made clear. But that is about 5 times the funding boost that's been allocated to schools over the next 4 years, and it's more than twice the extra money that's been allocated for public health care. School operations grants have received an increase of just 1.5% this year, and health spending increased by less than 5%. Now, the purpose of this is to integrate New Zealand into the US-led war plans against China. The Five Eyes, the imperialist alliance of the United States, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand, are coordinating their systems at a rapid pace to prepare for war as soon as 2027, according to some documents, a war involving nuclear-armed powers that threatens the entire world. The price will be paid for by the working class, both in lives and in the destruction of basic services and attacks on democratic rights. There are many indications now of a profound and worsening social crisis. Unemployment began rising sharply under the Labour government in 2023 from a low point of 3%, and it's now reached 5.3%. There are now 160,000 unemployed people, which is the biggest number since 1994. The situation is worse for young people, with 13.8% of people under the age of 25 not employed and not in education or training. Homelessness has also significantly increased under the last Labour government. In particular, the last census found that from 2018 to 2023, it increased from 102,000 people roundabout to 112,000 people who are classed as severely housing deprived, which is 2.3% of the population. And in the 2 years since that census, undoubtedly the situation has become even worse. Meanwhile, there's more than 500,000 people, 1 in 10 people, who are accessing food banks every month in order to survive. And more than a quarter of children, 27% of children, are living in food insecure households. Meanwhile, the country's richest 119 individuals, according to the National Business Review Rich List, and 119 individuals and families have a combined wealth of $102.1 billion, which is equivalent to 4.9% of the net wealth owned by all households. Meanwhile, the top 1% controls approximately 1/5 of the country's wealth. To put that in perspective, the annual health budget is $32.7 billion, so 1/3 of the amount controlled by just the people on the rich list. And the budget for schools is $13.4 billion, so 13% of the money held by 119 individuals. The October 23rd strike demonstrates that workers are trying to fight back. The same economic crisis that is leading to war and mass poverty is also leading to a radicalization of millions of workers and young people. who are moving to the left and increasingly supportive of socialist ideas. That is what we found when we spoke to people at the strike rally in Auckland. Workers are angry about the cost of living that they face and the pressures in their school or hospital, but also about homelessness and about the government pushing young people off unemployment benefits. They spoke out against spending money on war, the alliance with the United States, and the government's support for the genocidal regime in Israel. In response to Defence Minister Judith Collins, who tried to smear the strike by saying it was motivated by support for Palestine, one teacher told us, quote, "I'm quite happy for it to be about Palestine. I'm sick of working for a government that is supporting genocide, and I think we should have the right to strike about it." Now, anger and militancy will continue to grow inevitably, but the critical question is, what is to be done? What is the way forward for these workers? The unions have not scheduled any more joint strikes, such as the one on October 23rd. The leadership immediately went back into negotiations with the government behind closed doors. And during the strike itself, the speeches by union leaders were deliberately vague, and none of them put forward anything that could be described as a real concrete demand that they could be held to. They gave themselves a free hand to negotiate a sellout agreement, and the perspective of these really pro-capitalist bureaucrats was summed up by statements by the Public Service Association leader Fleur Fitzsimmons, who told News Talk ZB following the strike that workers were just asking for, quote, "pay to remain at its current level. They are not asking for big pay increases. They're simply asking to have inflation reflected in their pay." Now, freezing workers' wages at the rate of inflation, which is 3%, would in fact be a pay cut compared with the real cost of living that I cited earlier. The International Socialist Organization, which is a pseudo-left group that speaks for middle-class layers who orbit around the unions and the Labour Party, published an article in the lead up to the strike by an official in the New Zealand Nurses Organisation, a former president of that union, Grant Brooks, who rejected any struggle against capitalism, explicitly saying that moves to abolish capitalist exploitation in Aotearoa are unlikely in the near future. Instead, he said the strike had the potential to, quote, "not only break the government's grip on power, but also force changes far beyond what the Labour opposition would like to offer, and press to wider liberation for Maori, for Palestine, for women, and for others." Now, what does this mean? In other words, fighting for socialism is unrealistic. It's not on the agenda. But what workers can look forward to is replacing the national government with a Labour-led government, which supposedly will be pressured to enact more progressive policies than it would otherwise like to do. And that, basically echoes the position put forward by one speaker at the Auckland strike rally from the Primary Teachers Union, NZEI, who said this government better listen to us because there's an election next year. The Labour Party itself, on the day of the strike, Labour leader Chris Hipkins declared, quote, "I wholeheartedly support our nurses, doctors, midwives, dentists, healthcare workers, and teachers who have made the difficult decision to take this stand for safe staffing, fair pay, and decent working conditions." But austerity did not simply begin with the current coalition government. The situation in schools and hospitals is the result of years or decades, really, of attacks, including under the government of Jacinda Ardern and Chris Hipkins. As we have explained in some detail on the World Socialist website, From its first year in office in 2018, the Ardern government drastically underfunded health and education. This provoked the first nationwide strike by 30,000 public hospital nurses in nearly 30 years in 2018, and the following year, a strike by more than 50,000 primary and secondary teachers. The unions played the same role that they're playing today after they initially tried to get workers to accept a 2% pay rise in 2018. The NZNO reluctantly called a one-day strike of nurses and healthcare workers. It then presented these workers with an offer of 3% per year. And when that was rejected, it presented the same offer again, telling workers that it was the best deal that they could get. The claim that there was just no more money was repeated endlessly, both by the government and by union officials, even as the Labour government announced in the same week as the 2018 nurses' strike that it would pay $2.4 billion to buy new aeroplanes for the Air Force, about 4 times the amount it was spending on the nurses' pay settlement. The NZEI, the Primary Teachers Union, and the Post-Primary Teachers Association, the PPTA, imposed basically the same sellout agreement on teachers in 2019. None of these deals did anything to solve the crisis of understaffing, despite empty promises made by the Labour government. That left hospitals, in particular, totally unprepared for the COVID-19 pandemic, and that triggered further strikes in 2021. The Labour government, its main response to the pandemic was to exploit it, to give tens of billions of dollars to corporations and the rich, whose wealth soared. It then unleashed a public health disaster. With the assistance of the trade unions, at the end of 2021, Jacinda Ardern scrapped the initially successful zero COVID policy and adopted the homicidal policy of mass infection that had already led to millions of deaths around the world. As the hospitals were overwhelmed with COVID patients, the cost of living soared, with inflation going above 7%, homelessness became more entrenched, and child poverty increased. Pay equity agreements for nurses and allied health workers in 2023, which did lift their pay by about 15 to 20%, have to be balanced against what were years of frozen pay, soaring living costs, and worsening conditions. The Labour Party lost the 2023 election in a landslide because of the deepening social crisis that it was responsible for. Like the National Party, it spent that election campaigning for job cuts in the public sector. It handed down an austerity budget. And in its final days, the Labour leader, Chris Hipkins, openly supported the genocidal assault by Israel against Gaza and smeared the protests against it. Now, the claim by the International Socialist Organization and others, such as the Daily Blog and the BHN podcast, and other sort of pro-Labour Party outlets, that workers can expect better treatment from another Labour Greens coalition government in 2026, is simply a lie. It would be no different to the Labour governments in Britain and Australia, who are carrying out historic attacks on public services in those countries and funneling huge sums of money, unprecedented sums, into preparing for war. The Labour Party in New Zealand fully supports the national government's record war spending, and so does the union bureaucracy. Fleur Fitzsimmons, the leader of the PSA, who I cited earlier, criticised the government for not doing enough to build a modern, combat-ready defence force when tensions are rising across the Asia-Pacific area and in Europe. In other words, and she was quite specific about this, New Zealand has to do more to prepare for war against China. What this demonstrates is that the unions have cannot be described as workers' organizations. They ceased to be such decades ago. Everywhere in the world, they act as the enforcers of big business demands for cutbacks and the demands of the state for a militarized economy. The claims by pseudo-left organizations, including the ISO, that the unions are taking a stand in support of Palestine are utterly false. Internationally, including in Australia and New Zealand, the unions have refused to organise strike action to stop the production and shipment of weapons and other supplies to Israel. In the United States, the United Auto Workers and the Teamsters unions have openly supported Donald Trump's tariffs and other trade war measures, which is the prelude to war against China. In Germany, the unions and every party in parliament is supporting a rearmament program worth 1 trillion euros, the biggest increase in military spending since the Nazis, which is explicitly aimed at preparing for total war against Russia. Fake socialists like the ISO cover up these facts because they are aligned with imperialism. They supported the US-sponsored regime change war in Syria and are supporting the US-NATO war against Russia. They represent sections of the upper middle class who only ask for a bigger share of the wealth and a bigger political role within the capitalist system for themselves. Workers must understand that there is no reformist solution to the crisis they face. The situation today is analogous in that way to the 1930s. The alternatives are socialism or barbarism. And if the working class is not able to overthrow the capitalist system and solve the crisis in its interests, then it will be forced to accept the solution of the ruling class, which is fascism, dictatorship, and world war. New Zealand is in no way an exception. As was the case in World War I and World War II, the ruling elite in this country and its political parties are determined to take part in the redivision of the world for profit. So again, what is to be done? The International Committee of the Fourth International, our organisation, published a statement in January 2020 titled "The Decade of Socialist Revolution Begins," which analysed the implications of the upsurge of mass protests and strikes that was already underway at that point, as well as the turn towards fascism and war by the ruling class throughout the world. The objective conditions were emerging for socialist revolution, we explained. However, the spontaneous struggles of workers and their instinctive striving for socialism are by themselves inadequate. The transformation of the class struggle into a conscious movement for socialism is a question of political leadership. This point has been demonstrated over the past 2 years by the mass movement against the Gaza genocide. Despite the participation of millions of people from every part of the world, the protests by themselves have failed to halt this historic crime. Without a socialist perspective, the movement has been limited to making moral appeals to the very imperialist leaders who are responsible for the genocide, including Joe Biden, Donald Trump, Keir Starmer, and others, and Christopher Luxon, etc., Anthony Albanese. Our task is to solve the crisis of political leadership in the working class, and that means establishing its complete political independence from every capitalist party, including Labour and all of its allies, the Greens, Te Pāti Māori, and their pseudo-left cheerleaders. We urge everyone listening, if you are in New Zealand, to join the Socialist Equality Group and fight to build it into the New Zealand section of the Trotskyist movement, the International Committee of the Fourth International. This is the World Party of Socialist Revolution, which fights for the unification of the working class in every country, which is the only way to stop the descent into war and fascist barbarism. In our statement distributed during the October 23rd strike, we proposed a number of socialist demands, including an immediate 30% wage increase for all workers, which would be funded by tens of billions of dollars expropriated from the billionaires who dominate society. We called for that money to be used to expand the public health and education system, and for all major industries to be placed under the ownership and democratic control of the working class. We also called for an end to all military spending, the alliance with the United States, and all support for Israel. To fight for these demands, workers must organize collectively. There is no individual solution to the crisis of capitalism. Contrary to what union officials are telling workers, you cannot escape by moving to Australia, where the assault on living standards is intensifying and the Labour government is militarising the country to play a frontline role in war against China. But workers do need organisations. They need ones that they control, independent and opposed to the capitalist parties and the union bureaucracies that are conspiring to sell them out. We call for the formation of rank-and-file committees in every hospital, every school, every factory and other workplace across the country. As the Socialist Equality Party in Australia has explained, quote, such committees are democratic organisations of, by and for the working class, based upon a perspective of unyielding social struggle. They are the antithesis of the corrupt bureaucratic apparatuses of suppression and betrayal that describe themselves as trade unions. Organisations such as the Committee for Public Education and the Health Workers Rank and File Committee, initiated by the Socialist Equality Party in Australia, provide a forum for workers to discuss the problems they face and formulate the necessary strategy to mobilise against the plans of big business and the state. These committees must fight to overcome the divisions imposed by the unions by building an industrial and political movement that unites workers in every industry, in meat processing, dairy, fisheries, transportation, across the entire public sector and the private sector, including the 85% of workers in this country who are not union members. Rank and file committees must oppose every effort by the unions and the capitalist parties, both the New Zealand First Party as well as the Labour Party and its allies, to divide workers by inciting anti-immigrant sentiment, racism and nationalism. Our movement has launched the International Workers' Alliance of Rank and File Committees to link up and coordinate the struggles of workers in every country. Workers in Australia, New Zealand, and across Asia and the Pacific, and more broadly, confront all of the same multinational corporations and banks, which cannot be opposed within a single country. The International Workers' Alliance of Rank and File Committees and the Socialist Equality Party in the United States are holding an online public meeting next weekend, actually on Monday the 17th of November, New Zealand time, to discuss the way forward in the fight against hunger and the mass layoffs being imposed by the Trump administration. And I urge everyone here to register to attend this webinar, all of the details of which are on the World Socialist website. But rank and file committees must also organise international strikes to stop the ongoing slaughter in Gaza and all imperialist wars. The fight against genocide and war is international in scope, and it's inseparable from the struggle against austerity. The attempt by the New Zealand unions to try and exclude this issue, the issue of Gaza, from the mega strike demonstrates how utterly reactionary these organisations are. So once again, the objective conditions exist for building a powerful movement against capitalism. Workers want to fight. We don't have to persuade them to do that. But they will not spontaneously or automatically develop the socialist consciousness that they need. So the urgent task facing everyone in this meeting is to join and to build the only genuine socialist tendency that exists in the world today, which is this movement, the Socialist Equality Group in New Zealand and the International Committee of the Fourth International. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Tom, for what I think everyone who is in attendance would agree was a very in-depth and important report, placing the strike within its international context and drawing out very concretely what perspective is required to overcome the crisis that confronts New Zealand and, in that sense, workers internationally. One is struck by the figures you presented. The same concentration of wealth that one sees in other countries is present here in New Zealand. And with that, I will introduce our next and final speaker for this afternoon's meeting, Oscar Grenfell. Oscar is a member of the Socialist Equality Party in Australia's National Committee and is a leading member of our youth arm, the International Youth and Students for Social Equality. He writes prolifically for the World Socialist website on a broad range of issues, including Australian politics, the AUKUS agreement and the US-led military build-up against China, and the continued and ongoing assault against democratic rights. So I welcome Comrade Oscar.
Thanks very much, Max, and warmest greetings to comrades and friends in this meeting. It's very appropriate that we're holding this as a trans-Tasman and international meeting because the mega strike in New Zealand is objectively an international experience with immense relevance to the working class throughout the region and globally. We mean that in several respects. Firstly, the conditions producing mass anger and opposition have their source in a crisis of the global capitalist system and the response of governments everywhere, which is to make the working class pay. Secondly, and for that reason, the strike is an indicator of what's coming everywhere, including in Australia. Here, as in New Zealand, key sections of the working class are and will be propelled into struggle, including by the unbearable conditions in the hospitals and the schools, the push for speed-ups across the public and private sectors, and the suppression of pay amid the ongoing cost of living crisis. And finally, the movement represented by the mega strike can only advance on the basis of a consciously international perspective. In opposition to the global strategy of the banks and the corporations, whose interests dictate a continuous race to the bottom in terms of pay and conditions, the SEG and the Socialist Equality Party in Australia advance an international strategy for the working class. The unification of workers in New Zealand and Australia would increase their strength by orders of magnitude. It would be an enormous blow to the forces of the political establishment on both sides of the Tasman, which promote nationalism to divide the working class, to cover over the real causes of the social crisis, and to present what are inherently international problems as local ones. This issue emerged quite directly in the mega strike itself. In condemning the drive by the national-led government to suppress wages, and in pointing to the dire conditions facing New Zealand public sector workers, the union officials counterposed the situation there to what exists in Australia. The line that they peddled was that whereas public sector wages are low in New Zealand, Australian public sector staff receive quote unquote competitive or even generous pay. This depiction of Australia as a land of milk and honey spanned the whole gamut of social issues. The New Zealand union officials claimed that here workplace conditions are fair, the cost of living is not so bad, workers can have a decent and fulfilling life on the other side of the Tasman. All in all, the union officials sounded as though they were paid migration agents. To workers in Australia, all of this is completely unrecognisable because it's so divorced from reality. The deliberately disorienting impact of such claims was clear in the comments of some of the workers we spoke to at the strike rally itself. Just for instance, one health worker told us that whereas home ownership in Auckland was out of reach for working people, in Sydney, you could buy a house for a few $100,000 and live comfortably. That may have been the case numbers of decades ago, but it's certainly not the situation today. In fact, the housing market in Sydney is pretty well as inflated as anywhere in the world. The annual Demographia International Housing Affordability Study ranks affordability across 8 advanced capitalist countries, including Australia and New Zealand. And this year, Sydney was the second least affordable city, behind only Hong Kong. Sydney received an impossibly unaffordable rating, with the report finding that median house prices across the city are between 9 and 15 times the median household income. Citywide, the overall median house price is now a staggering $1.75 million. Confusions among workers, such as the one that I just cited, are not their fault, but are the product of a campaign of outright misinformation by the New Zealand trade union bureaucracy. I'll just quote a couple of the claims that have been made by union officials and show how false they are. At the Auckland strike rally itself, Paul Stevens, the regional chair of the Post-Primary Teachers Association, denounced the bogus claims of Public Sector Minister Judith Collins that New Zealand teachers are well paid. But he then made his own bogus claims about teacher pay in Australia. Just to quote, Stevens declared, "At the risk of offering people further enticement to move to the sunburnt country, we may not earn anywhere near $147,000 a year, but they, that is, Australian teachers, often do." Now, one only needs to look up the pay rates of Australian teachers to see that that's just not true. In the state of Victoria, for instance, the starting salary for a new teacher is just $78,000. The maximum annual pay is $126,000, but the average is little over $90,000, and that pay level is stagnant. In New South Wales, the starting salary for a teacher is around $90,000, with the most experienced cohort receiving a maximum of $129,000 and an average for high school teachers of just over $100,000. A 2023 study by the University of Sydney Business School found, I quote, "On top of a continuing decline in teachers' salaries compared to the average of all professions, the real earnings of New South Wales teachers fell by about 5.7% between 2020 and 2022 due to salary increases that were far below inflation increases." And the study's authors noted that in real terms, teacher pay in New South Wales hasn't advanced over the course of an entire decade. Teachers, like other sections of the working class, have been completely priced out of the housing market. Already in 2023, and house prices have grown substantially since then, a study found that 90% of teachers in New South Wales worked in areas that they couldn't afford to buy a house or to rent in. At the mega strike, workers said that the fight for pay increases was only one component of their struggle. Just as important was the fact that conditions in New Zealand schools and hospitals are worse than they've ever been and are increasingly unbearable. That's exactly the same in Australia. A 2023 survey of 4,000 teachers across the country found that almost 47% were considering leaving the profession within the next 12 months. 70% reported unmanageable workloads, and more than half of the total indicated symptoms consistent with depression. The New Zealand Health Union bureaucrats are telling exactly the same sort of lies. Anne Daniels, the president of the New Zealand Nurses Organisation, appeared on a panel discussion the day before the mega strike. She said that nurses from New Zealand were emigrating to Australia, quote, "where they can get better pay, where they can be valued, where they can have career options, and where they can have nurse-to-patient ratios so they can do the job that they should be doing in the way they should be doing it in a timely manner." In fact, the average salary for an enrolled nurse in Australia is around $70,000 and $88,000 for a registered nurse. That puts them among the lower paid sections of the working class and is far below the average annual salary of roughly $100,000. The Anglicare charity last month released its annual rental affordability snapshot, which is based on listed properties over a weekend, and it found that just 1.5% of advertised rental properties were affordable on a nurse's salary. As for conditions, the public hospitals here are in a state of complete meltdown. One indication is the huge increase in ramping, that is the practice where ambulances are forced to wait outside hospitals with patients because there are no staffed beds. The Australian Medical Association reported this year that rates of ramping have more than doubled in some states since the beginning of the pandemic. The AMA's president, Dr. Daniel McMullen, said the levels of ramping are, quote, alarming, with reports of people tragically dying while waiting for an ambulance or dying in ambulances waiting for admission to hospital. The extent of the staffing crisis and the bed shortage was perhaps exemplified by one case last month. We had the shocking situation of a pregnant woman being forced to give birth on the couch of a waiting room of Westmead Hospital, which is one of the largest in Sydney, because there were simply no beds available. As in New Zealand, the dire conditions facing public sector workers are a consequence not only of the pro-business policies of successive governments, but of the actions of the union bureaucracies, which have enforced one sellout after another. In 2022, there were mass strikes by healthcare workers, teachers, and other public sector staff in New South Wales. The unions divided these struggles up, preventing any unified strike action. And then they rammed through sellout deals, which were pegged to the then inflation rate under conditions where it was soaring and was substantially understating the real increase to the cost of living. In the same year, 2022, the Victorian Teachers Union rammed through a sellout in the face of substantial opposition, which locked in annual pay increases of just 2%. That was a major real wage cut. Teachers in Queensland are currently in a struggle against attempts by the state government to impose an agreement limiting pay increases to 8% over 3 years. The deal wouldn't do anything to address understaffing and massive workloads. Again, the Queensland Teachers Union has limited industrial action as much as it possibly can, and last week it put the same sellout offer to teachers that they'd rejected multiple times before. Very significantly, despite that union pressure, the teachers again voted it down. Given how false their depiction is, the obvious question is, why is it that the union officials in New Zealand paint conditions in Australia in such rosy hues? The answers are political, and all of them are aimed at preventing the sort of sustained industrial and political struggle that's required. Firstly, the de facto promotion of emigration to Australia promotes the fraud that there's some individual solution to the crisis afflicting New Zealand workers. Of course, we defend the right of workers to live and to work wherever they choose, and we oppose all restrictions on migration. But workers from New Zealand who do migrate to Australia hoping for improved pay and social conditions will find an almost identical crisis. And in many respects, they're treated as second class, being denied government welfare and other basic rights unless they're citizens. The propaganda from the New Zealand unions is a peculiar, almost inverted form of nationalism. It presents the situation in New Zealand as an aberration, and that goes hand in hand with the claims that this is just an issue of the national-led government and that New Zealand Labor would be an alternative. Tom's already gone through the record of Labor in New Zealand, but it should be noted that the dire conditions facing Australian workers have been enforced by Labor governments, both at the state and the federal levels. Amid the cost of living crisis, the Albanese government has rejected any relief, overseeing a situation where real incomes have declined on average by at least 4.8% compared with the period before the pandemic, in one of the sharpest reversals of an OECD country. Labor is taking the axe to social spending, including by kicking hundreds of thousands of people off the National Disability Insurance Scheme. In the States, the Labor governments are implementing similar austerity measures, the brutality of which is summed up by their destruction of what remains of public housing in Victoria and New South Wales. Vulnerable and poor residents are literally being kicked out of their homes, which are to be demolished to the benefit of the property developers. The reality globally is that whatever their nominal political coloration, whether they're social democratic or conservative, capitalist governments are carrying out a program of reaction all down the line. The programs of Albanese, a so-called Labor left, and of Luxon, a conservative who governs in coalition with the far right, are nearly identical. And that's not only on the social front. Both of these figures are fawning over and seeking to win the graces of US President Donald Trump, helping to legitimize his attempt to establish a fascist dictatorship in America. And both of them are carrying out their own attacks on immigrants who are being scapegoated for a social crisis caused by the pro-business policies of these governments themselves. Albanese and Luxon have supported the Israeli genocide in Gaza, branding them as complicit in some of the worst war crimes since the Holocaust, and that's only one expression of their involvement of an eruption of imperialist militarism threatening a new world war. Albanese's centrepiece policy is completing Australia's transformation into a frontline state for war with China. That includes the AUKUS Pact to purchase nuclear-powered submarines from the US at the staggering cost of $368 billion. It also includes a vast expansion of US basing with some of American imperialism's most potent strike assets, including those that can be equipped with nuclear weapons to be stationed in Australia. The New Zealand government, too, is deepening its intelligence and military ties with the US. In opposition to this pro-imperialist unity above, we're fighting to develop a socialist and anti-war unity from below. With the advances in technology, it's possible for workers in Australia, New Zealand, and all over the world to communicate in real time. Sharing their common experiences will undermine the nationalism promoted by the unions, including, for instance, the false claims of the New Zealand union bureaucrats about the great situation in Australia. The extent of the integration between the two countries, economically, politically, and in terms of the population itself, greatly facilitates the fight for such unity. But above all, this is a political question. The first step is the establishment of rank and file committees controlled by workers themselves, not by privileged bureaucrats. Through such committees, workers can plan a real campaign of industrial and political action, including joint action internationally. We view that as one component of the fight to build a socialist movement of the working class here and all over the world. Because as Tom reviewed, we are living through a breakdown of capitalism, and the fight for all of the social interests of the working class requires a frontal assault on the oligarchy, the governments that represent it, and a profit system that's hurtling towards disaster. Thanks.
Well, thanks, Oscar, for, again, what I think all who are in attendance will agree, a very comprehensive and critical report, which really smashes apart the conception, really, of New Zealand exceptionalism, as he says, an inverted form in which the idea is promoted that workers in Australia live in some form of lap of luxury. And as he said at the beginning, the Trans-Tasman, really international meeting we're holding today, is an expression of what is required in the struggle that must be taken forward, the uniting of workers in particular across Australia and New Zealand, but also internationally. Now, we want to encourage this afternoon as much discussion as possible on these critical questions that have been raised in the two reports presented. If you would like to raise a question, please, in the chat, indicate. You can type your question in and send it out. I will pose those questions to the speakers who are here. And these questions can be on anything at all. I mean, we are seeking, as I said, the most open discussion as possible on the critical points that have been raised in the course of this meeting. In that sense, this is a very important expression of the very points that were raised by both Tom and Oscar of the necessity for democratic discussion amongst workers in different countries, and in particular between Australia and New Zealand. We have some comments that I will also read out that perhaps Tom or Oscar can begin by responding to. And while they're responding to some of those comments, please send in more questions. So there is, Isidore has made a comment saying, sadly, New Zealanders still think of themselves as working class and middle class and can't grasp it's a workers' struggle against the ruling elite. So that's one point that has been raised, and maybe the two speakers can respond to that. And there's also a comment from Sue Phillips, who is the national convener of the Committee for Public Education in Australia, who writes, in contrast to the appalling wages of teachers in Victoria, the president of the Teachers Union in Victoria receives a salary of between $230,000 and $260,000. And it gives you an indication of just the contrast that exists there. So perhaps, Tom, did you want to make some initial points in response to the comment I read out?
Yes. Well, thank you, Max, and thank you to Isidore, who wrote in the comment. I guess sadly, New Zealanders think of themselves as working class and middle class. I think you mean to say middle class and can't grasp it's a workers' struggle against the ruling elite. In our experience of speaking to workers during this mega strike and the previous strikes by teachers and nurses, what we have found among those sections of workers, there is a sense that professions that used to consider themselves relatively middle class, perhaps 40 or 50 years ago, very much now see themselves as being ground down and as part of the working class. I don't think there is, I mean, if I'm interpreting the comment correctly, I don't think it's the case that that workers in these areas see themselves as sort of part of a privileged middle class layer. I mean, they are well aware they've suffered a very long-term decline in their social position and working conditions and the purchasing power of their salary. And I mean, just for example, it's often said that, and it's true, that during the 1970s, a teacher in New Zealand could earn the same as a member of parliament. And today, it's less than half what an MP receives. If you talk to senior nurses who've been in the job for about 20 or 30 years, they can describe the very stark decline in conditions, and they all say it's a lot harder for young nurses who are starting today than it was when they first entered the healthcare profession themselves. So look, I mean, there are problems in the consciousness of the working class. I mean, for instance, we are not yet a mass socialist party, and that has to change, as I indicated in my report. But the impact of the objective crisis of capitalism is causing workers to change their minds as well, and to see themselves as part of the working class. And there is a much higher awareness of the enormous power of the super rich, the way that they control politics. These changes are taking place. It's the job of this movement to explain that the cause of this is the crisis of capitalism, that you can't solve it by voting in a Labour government. and that what is required is the political independence of workers from all of the capitalist parties through the construction of a socialist and internationalist movement. So hopefully that addresses or goes some way to addressing that question.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. And we have another question that's come in and some attendees with their hand up who would like to make some points, which I will call on to speak. I'll initially call on Kerry, who has her hand up.
Thank you. I wondered if you could, the panel could help me basically on the case for expropriation. And I'm referring to the recent article on the World Socialist website, which was talking about Elon Musk's massive $1 trillion payout. But I do, within that article, just find it a tiny bit confusing about, I'm all for taking their wealth. I'd rather take their wealth than eat them. So just part of this article, which I've just taken sections of, which is, of course, not fair when you're talking about an article written like this, but just parts of it says the rise of Musk's wealth embodies the vast enrichment of America's financial elite. Musk's wealth is built on a series of financial bubbles, each bigger than the last. Musk sits atop a paper fortune, a classic definition of a Ponzi scheme. And there's other parts where it says that we can expropriate the wealth hoarded by the oligarchs. But it's a little bit confusing to me. Are we taking wealth that's paper money? Are we taking real wealth? I'm interested in the mechanism to expropriate ill-gotten gains for our futures. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Kerry. Well, we'll put that, on the list and comrades can answer that presently. And just before I call on the next person to speak, who is John, who is also a leading member of the Socialist Equality Group in New Zealand, there is a question that is within the chat that perhaps even John can speak to, which is from Hazel, who writes, Unfortunately, there is a deep sense of hopelessness in my community of young people in New Zealand. How do I best mobilise those around me to join the fight when they are all exhausted and defeated by the day-to-day struggle of the current conditions? So, John, if you would like to contribute, you should be able to unmute.
Thank you, Max. Well, I think this last question is also related to the earlier question, really, about the sense of what's going on in the New Zealand working class. But just one comment in relation to Oscar's point about the peculiar sort of sense of nationalism that's promoted by the union bureaucracy. In every dispute that arises virtually in New Zealand, if it can be found that there's an Australian company involved or an Australian employer, which is often the case, the unions raise the point, they say, the Australian employers are hard-nosed, which New Zealand employers apparently aren't, and that enables them to sort of involve themselves in all sorts of dealings and with so-called, sympathetic and softer New Zealand employers. It's a device really for sellouts. But just in relation to some of the important figures relating to the position of the New Zealand working class, over 40% of workers last year got no pay increase at all, under conditions where the official inflation rate is around 3% at the moment. But prices, as Tom's slide showed, are well above that. Amongst the unemployed, the most oppressed sections of the working class, unemployment among Maori workers is 10.5%. Among Pacific workers, it's 12.1%. There's a record 406,000 workers who are underutilised, in other words, would like more work but can't get it. Youth unemployment is soaring. And just in the last month, the government has introduced a new rule that 18 and 19-year-olds whose parents earn above a certain nominal amount will no longer qualify for social welfare benefits. If they're living at home, their parents will basically have to take responsibility for them. These conditions are dire, and this does explain, I think, some of the feelings of hopelessness now that are impacting on some young people. But where does the responsibility for this lie? Well, we have, these are important historical questions. The working class had an important experience from 2017 onwards under the Ardern Labor government. And Tom has written recently on this experience where repeatedly workers went into struggle against low pay, the problem with working conditions, and time and again, these struggles were sold out by the unions who were supporters of the Labor-led government. Even now, after the mega strike, workers are still voting for strike action. Workers still want to fight, but they're being hemmed in at every side. Just on Friday, Professional Firefighters Union called off a strike, saying that they were, going back into talks with the employer. The nurses' organisation in recent weeks has declared that any future action won't involve an actual strike, but will simply involve nurses refusing to cover for absent colleagues or not do overtime and so on. So the entire struggle of workers that erupted on October the 23rd is now being consciously wound back. And I think in trying to come to grips with the moods of the working class, one has to look at the question of political leadership and political perspective. What they're seeing is that the organisations of the Labor Party and the trade unions have got nothing to offer, and in fact are now acting as policemen for declining conditions and wages. I mean, the Council of Trade Unions has just put out a brand new statement called A New Deal for Workers, which contains what they say are the core policies for the next election. Well, the next election is 12 months away. And so basically what they're sort of telling workers is that you can't do anything now. They're not putting forward any perspective on which workers can fight this government. They're simply saying, well, you have to wait now for the new, what they're calling the new progressive government, by which they mean yet another Labor government, in a year's time. And the program they're putting forward is to reinstate what Labor called fair pay agreements, which basically is a program for enabling the unions to strengthen their grip as policemen of the working class, including no strike clauses. The situation facing workers doesn't come from the sky. It's a product of a long period of betrayals and shattered hopes, going, in the case of the Labor Party, back to the 1980s and the Longy Douglas government. The consciousness of the working class is bound up with these very significant historical questions. There's a very important quote from Trotsky, who was writing about the Spanish Civil War. Now, this is not exactly the same situation as the Spanish Civil War, but he was replying to the comment by various pseudo-leftists that the Spanish working class couldn't raise themselves to the historic occasion. Well, Trotsky observed that there was no lack of fight amongst the Spanish working class, but what was critical was the question of perspective, parties, and leadership. And I think that's what we're raising in this discussion, is the necessity for a leadership and a party and a perspective. Our group was the only group handing out leaflets with a perspective at the Auckland rally. Nobody else had anything else to offer except the Socialist Equality Group, and that's what we're fighting for here.
Thanks, John. Oscar would like to make some points. I'll call on Oscar to speak.
Yeah, I think these are really critical questions because they do pose the issue of what is to be done. How is a socialist perspective fought for. And I think in considering the confusions that exist among young people, it's important, as John did, to place that within a broader historical context. I mean, we are coming out of a period really spanning best part of 40 years where the class struggle has been suppressed, or, you know, as it's sometimes put, the class struggle has been waged by one side. I mean, the period of the 1980s, Thatcher and Reagan, but then here and in New Zealand, Labor governments which carried out sweeping attacks on workers' jobs, conditions, presided over the destruction of entire industries, and the union bureaucracies were transformed as well. I mean, they became the open agents of ensuring the international competitiveness of their own national industry, essentially a race to the bottom, one concessions deal after the next. And that suppression of the class struggle has had an impact on the whole political, cultural atmosphere. I think, you know, if you add to that what occurred in 1991, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and the claims that, you know, socialism was dead, capitalism may have its problems, but it's the best of all possible worlds. Now, in opposition to that sort of capitalist triumphalism, our movement insisted that the dissolution of the Soviet Union was not a failure of socialism, it was the final betrayal of Stalinism. And in fact, it presaged a crisis of the entire imperialist world order. And I think that's unquestionably been proven correct. I mean, we're living now under conditions of a sort of generalized global crisis of capitalism. You can point to so many manifestations of it: the drive by Trump to establish a dictatorship in America, the center of world imperialism, the normalization of out and out barbarism in the form of the Gaza genocide. And then, you know, as we've been discussing on the social front, the conditions that workers face are simply impossible. And we know that that's what propels the development of the class struggle. I think that is the significance of the mega strike. I mean, it was only one day. The unions limited it as much as they could, and they've called no further action. But it was an indicator that the class struggle is re-emerging. There is a mood of social opposition in the working class and also among the youth. And I think, you know, we comment on these when they come out, but every now and then a think tank or a polling group surveys young people as to their attitude to socialism. And almost always it's a favourable attitude. I mean, there's one I'm just looking at from May this year, which found that 62% of Americans aged 18 to 29 say they hold a favourable view of socialism. 34% say the same of communism. I mean, this is the land of sort of official anti-communism, which has been almost a state religion in America for the entire post-World War II period. But the experiences that people are passing through are politically radicalising them. That doesn't mean that the issues of program and perspective are resolved spontaneously. I think that comes to the critical role of our movement, which has to be built, developed, because we are a party of history. I mean, we base ourselves on all the lessons of the 20th century, the Russian Revolution, the first time that the working class took political power and began transforming society, the lessons of the betrayal of that revolution by the Stalinist bureaucracy, and the many experiences of the 20th century, revolutions, counter-revolutions, and betrayed revolutions. That understanding, historical consciousness, you know, has to be brought into the working class, you know, brought into the youth to provide them with, you know, a historical framework through which to view the issues that they confront today.
Thanks, Oscar, for those remarks. And I would like to make some additional remarks to Oscar on this question of young people. But just before I do, to deal with Kerry's remarks on the question of Ponzi scheme, paper money, I mean, we are, in that sense, working through the question of what it means, what finance capital means, which rests something like a parasite. If you think of the world, you know, or as, you know, the whole of the production of GDP finance capital, fictitious capital like that of Tesla and Elon Musk exists as something of a tick, like a leech, sucking away from that broader amount within the world without actually producing or developing anything. But that doesn't mean that it's just simply fake money. That money has to be put back into that system. How is that done? Speed ups, a tax on wages, etc. So whilst in that sense, we talk about it like, and it is a Ponzi, like a Ponzi scheme, it is not in that sense just a fake claim on wealth. There is, in that sense, under capitalism, legally enforceable processes for that money to be extracted by Musk and Tesla. And that comes through, as we've discussed, the fundamental attacks on the working class. And just to make a general point, when we talk about the expropriation of private property, we're not, and the wealth of the banks, we're not looking for, in that sense, a secret suitcase full of money or something like that. I'm saying you're implying that, but it's the expropriation of all the various mechanisms that are utilized for the vast enrichment of the ruling oligarchy, including that is this nationalization of production, the seizure of the banks and assets, and various other measures that are required to utilize that money, not for the enrichment of a small minority, as is the case of Musk, an individual that now will be worth more than $1 trillion over 10 years, or will be, be paid out the equivalent of that over 10 years, but for the betterment of everybody, for the elevation of society. Now, such a process is not able to occur under conditions of capitalism. You can't, in that sense, vote in a socialist who will resolve these issues. And in that sense, I think, jumping back to Hazel's question, I mean, young people, as Oscar has indicated, are looking for alternatives. We see this with the mayoral election in New York City, in which somebody who was on the ticket as a socialist, Mamdani, won the election as mayor, and he won it with a quite substantial margin. Above all, with votes from young people who, by again a very large margin, in fact, voted in favour of Mamdani. Now, he is not a socialist. He is a member of the Democratic Socialists of America. They are a pseudo-left front who give support to the Democrats, a left face to the Democrats. I mean, the most recent example of how they fall completely in line with the Democrats was when it came out that there was a Democratic candidate that had a Nazi tattoo, in other words, a fascist. They came out in his complete defense, saying anyone who is raising this question of the Nazi tattoo is engaging in character assassination. I mean, they represent nothing to do with socialism and everything to do with propping up the capitalist state. Nonetheless, there is objective significance for the fact that he won this vote, and it demonstrates that young people are seeking an alternative, but the issue is political perspective. And in raising this question, I wanted to point those who are here and listening to some of what we've produced on the World Socialist website. I mean, currently, we are in the process of publishing all the lectures of the US Summer School, which occurred this year, which was on security in the Fourth International, which was an examination of the assassination of Leon Trotsky, which was not merely, in that sense, a forensic exercise, although it unveiled very important information. It was above all a political fight and struggle against Stalinism and all the counter-revolutionary agents, including Pabloism and the capitalist state itself. And in going through that, there is just the most recent lectures, and this is why I'm relaying it, because I think it's important and connected, was the assassination of Tom Heenahan in 1977. And he was assassinated under very spurious kind of conditions. I mean, it was clear that at least the police investigation itself was one in which there was no proper information wasn't gathered, etc. But what I think was important in an article that was published, it was published in 2022, but it was the republication of a lecture or a speech that was given by Comrade David North on October 19th, 1977, on the 20th anniversary of Tom Heenahan's lecture, dealing with what animates young people, what is the significance of the question of program and perspective being gripped by young people? And he works through and addresses at the end of this very, very powerful, working over and tribute and commemoration of Heenahan's life, a conclusion addressing the younger generation. And he says at one stage that through no fault of their own, now this was written in 1997, it is just as true in 2025, that is no fault of their own, young people, youth have been cut off from the revolutionary spirit that looms so large throughout the first 3/4 of this century. But also they've been cut off from the intellectual traditions that inspired earlier generations of youth to immerse themselves in great and self-sacrificing social struggles. And as he works through, young people are the victims of a ferocious assault, promoting postmodernist identity politics, really conceptions that are the antithesis of a conception of a broad struggle of the masses of workers and young people. Money becomes the completely glorified. It must be worshipped at all stages. And we see this in many, many aspects of pop culture and popular music and the like. But as he says, history shows that the dominance of such empty and egotistical conceptions is characteristic of a society that is in a process of decay and dissolution. The youth must free themselves intellectually and practically from this fetid environment. They must think of the future and assume responsibility for it. They must ask themselves why and for what purpose are they alive. Tom Heenahan asked himself these questions and acted seriously and passionately upon the answers he found. And in doing so, he lived a life of enduring significance. I mean, we must fight in all aspects to bring to bear this program and perspective to young people. We approach the future with a scientifically grounded revolutionary optimism. The same crises that are giving rise to the horrors that youth are confronting are giving rise to its opposite. And young people, young students must turn to workers. Young workers must draw these lessons and turn to older workers and bring to bear this analysis. And, as we have been outlining in these meetings, form independent rank and file committees in their workplaces to begin to discuss these essential questions, but also, I think, make the very important and critical life-changing decision of joining the International Committee of the Fourth International, whether it's through the Socialist Equality Group in New Zealand or the Socialist Equality Party in Australia, to take up that fight, take responsibility for one's future as a young person and transform it. So I just wanted to make those points, and Comrade Tom would like to make some more points on that.
Yeah, well, I strongly concur with what Max has just raised, and also Oscar and John. Firstly, just regarding the point that Kerry asked about, what exactly are we talking about when we're talking about Elon Musk's wealth? I mean, I think a lot of people are asking themselves this question. Is this money actually real? I mean, what we see in the case of Tesla is a vastly overinflated company, as we explain in the World Socialist website article, a company that produces cars and other things, but that is really not anywhere remotely enough to justify or to pay for the $1 trillion that Elon Musk is being promised, which is out of all proportion to anything that can be earned simply by producing cars. In reality, it's a gigantic Ponzi scheme, as Max explained. Like most of the tech companies, the artificial intelligence companies that are now propping up the stock market in the United States, and there are more and more warnings that it's heading for a crash. So these are claims on wealth, essentially. Elon Musk is being promised $1 trillion, a promise that has to be fulfilled by dramatically intensifying the exploitation of the working class, ripping up the whole social welfare system to squeeze more and more out of workers. And that requires a fascist regime, a dictatorship in the United States, which is what the Trump administration is seeking to bring about. But there is a real economy, of course. There are real forces of production, factories and technologies that exist. They've got to be taken out of the hands of the ruling class, and that's what we're talking about in terms of expropriating the bourgeoisie. The means of production have to be placed under workers' control and ownership. And that's the only way to end inequality, to bring about a socialist society. On the question that Hazel raised about the hopelessness among young people, and how can they be mobilized to fight when they're exhausted. I mean, a lot of the good points have already been made. The conditions facing young people are exceptionally dire. I mean, as I mentioned, the unemployment rate for young people in New Zealand under 25 is almost 3 times the overall unemployment rate. It's about 13 or 14%. And the sort of jobs and wages that people that age can get are also generally very low paid and insecure. But the sense of hopelessness is, it's not simply about that, as I think other speakers have mentioned, that there is poverty and hardship, but there's also a sort of political hopelessness or crisis of perspective, which is the result of many decades of political betrayals by the Labour Party and the suppression of the class struggle. If you look at the abstention rate in elections, there's many young people who don't even enroll to vote and who abstain from voting because there's no one worth supporting. So all of this has had an influence, as well as the comrades have mentioned, that the decades of demonization of socialism, the promotion of all forms of individualism and identity politics. I think also I just wanted to mention this book, which I did refer to in my speech, on the logic of Zionism, which is a series of lectures about the genocide in Gaza and how to fight against it, which I think is highly relevant and makes a number of points about the radicalization of young people. And this is by David North, the leading the editor of the World Socialist website and a leading Trotskyist in the United States. And he says this is in a lecture given in October 24, 2023, on the genocide that was then just a few weeks old. As he says, we're witnessing throughout the world a rising tide of working class struggle. It will assume dimensions of a magnitude unprecedented in world history. I mean, that's our perspective. And the events of the last several weeks have demonstrated how rapidly social consciousness changes, how rapidly people are radicalized by events which they had not foreseen. And he goes on and says one of the elements of the last 40 years, particularly in the aftermath of the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, was a certain apathy, ennui, a sense of hopelessness, a retreat into the individual, the personal, the concentration and focus on questions of personal identity, lifestyle, inordinate amount of times spent in gyms, improving one's figure, watching one's weight, monitoring every aspect of one's personal petty activity, while ignoring the great events unfolding all around. Suddenly, we can see this in the mass demonstrations taking place all over the world. A change has begun. What preoccupies the world today is the danger of global war, the use of genocide against innocent people, poverty, the destruction of the environment, a massive pandemic which kills millions, for which no government has an answer, not even one so simple as asking people to wear masks rather than becoming ill, because to do so in one way or another gets in the way of accumulating personal wealth and profit. But what is really stimulating and changing the world conditions is the sudden resurgence of the most basic and powerful of all social forces, the working class as an international force. He says, this in itself, the re-emergence of strikes, the mass protests against the genocide, does not mean that the problems which confront workers are easily resolved. They enter into the struggles with rotten leadership, with organizations that betray them, and with little understanding of the history of the class struggle, not only in their own country, but on an international scale. And herein lies the immense significance of the Fourth International. Our party is the concentrated expression of the whole historical experience of the class over an entire epoch. As he says elsewhere in another lecture in this book, there's mass anger among young people. The question is what to do with that anger. He says, those of you who are sickened by what you see, what are the political conclusions you are going to draw? What is required to put an end to this? And urges young people in particular to transform your anger and outrage into effective political action, into the determination to master Marxist theory, to learn the lessons of history, to acquaint yourself with the great revolutionary struggles of the last century. And I think that is what we really want you to take away, hopefully, from this discussion, and to make the decision, as Max said, to join our movement and begin your study of Marxism and to become a socialist.
Well, look, thanks, Tom. I think those points are a good summation of some of the essential points that we have drawn out in the course of the discussion. And look, if there are other questions and points, still put them in the chat. If we can't get to it this meeting, we will get in contact with you. If we don't have your contact details, please give them to us, email, phone number. You can send it directly to host and panelists so that, it's not visible for everybody because we do want to build this movement. We do want the discussion to continue beyond this meeting. It really is essential for the development of what really is required in the next period and very urgently, revolutionary socialist consciousness. With that, I will move on to some other announcements. We have been, in the course of this meeting, referring to a number of publications from Mering Books, which I think do constitute the critical element of the development of consciousness, that is, the history and program and perspective of our movement. Tom quoted from The Logic of Zionism in his final contribution, and they really are quite powerful. I mean, the lectures in the volume, which are a series of lectures given over the course of the period from when the genocide started, developing the understanding of the role, logic, and history of Zionism, which above all culminate really in a powerful call for international action by the working class in defense of the Palestinian people. This book, which, as I said, I think is really critical, is $20. It can be ordered either through, if you email sep.wellington@gmail.com and indicate that you would like a copy, we can get it to you. Alternatively, if you're in Australia, you can visit mering.com.au to make that order. This is the same for The Rise of Trump and the Crisis of American Democracy, which again, Tom quoted at the very beginning of his report. The return of Trump to power represents the violent realignment of the American political superstructure to correspond with the real social relations that exist in the United States. Now, this was the analysis published by the WSWS following Trump's second election, and it underscores the central theme of this collection. Trump's rise and return to power is not an aberration, but the product of deep-rooted crises in American and world capitalism. The statements collected in this volume trace the emergence of Trump, the political forces that enabled him, and the essential strategy for opposing his government. And that is also $20, as I said, can be gathered from either mering.com or through emailing sep.wellington@gmail.com. The next book is called The Pike River, The Crime and Cover-Up, of which Tom Peters, who gave the main report, is the author. I mean, this goes through the November 19th, 2010 explosion that rocked the underground Pike River mine in New Zealand. And then after a second explosion, 5 days later, 29 workers underground were declared dead. I think this book is essential for everyone's collection. There is an ongoing and precipitous rise in the number of deaths of workers internationally, but not least of which in mining, including in Australia, where just recently you have had the death of 2 workers at Cobar in an underground mine. There is obviously the most recent, and it's getting a lot of press, I believe, in New Zealand, the new book on Pike River, But this book covers up the role played by the Labor Party and trade unions in allowing this disaster to happen and then protecting the company afterwards. These are the essential lessons that must be drawn from this disaster in order to know not only in that sense who the enemies are, but what perspective must be brought forward. Sorry, as I said, there's a film that's been released on Pike River, and that covers up these roles. So please, I really encourage you to purchase this book. I mean, it documents, works through the role of labour and the trade unions, and really outlines a correct perspective in how to fight against what's being brought forward by both the kind of conspiracy of labour, the company, and the trade unions. And that's $20 plus postage. And finally, a pamphlet that we have called How the Working Class Was Betrayed, Stalinism, the Socialist Action League, and New Zealand's 1990 Labour government. And these are a series of essays which outline the right-wing restructuring carried out by the 1980s Labour government in New Zealand. It explains how it works with the trade union bureaucracy and its Stalinist leadership to prepare public services for privatisation by sacking tens of thousands of workers. The pamphlet also explains the role of the Pabloite Socialist Action League, which sought to chain workers to labour and the union apparatus and prevent the development of a genuine socialist movement. Now, this is available particularly in New Zealand for $5. Again, email the email that's on screen. For Mering in Australia, we are going to be publishing and printing this. So if you are interested, please let us know, and we will make sure that we reserve a copy for you of this pamphlet. There is a rank and file committee meeting, or a meeting calling for the building of rank and file committees to fight against layoffs and hunger that is occurring as part of the fight by the International Workers Alliance of Rank and File Committees and the Socialist Equality Party in the United States. We will put a link in the chat if you are interested in joining. It'll be on Monday, November 17th at 9 a.m. New Zealand time and 7 a.m. Sydney time. I mean, they're very reasonable times for us here, which is not necessarily always the case with meetings in the United States. So really important that you register to attend and join. But finally, I think, as all of the speakers today have indicated, we really encourage all of those who are here to make the most important decision of your life and join the Socialist Equality Party or Socialist Equality Group. It is these two parties that represent the International Committee of the Fourth International in New Zealand and Australia. The critical component for the outcome of history is the development of a revolutionary party in anticipation of mass revolutionary struggles. Those struggles are on the cards. It is clear through the mass degradation of social and living conditions of workers. Workers will respond to this. But what we need to do in preparation is the development of a revolutionary leadership that can take that struggle forward and on a socialist and internationalist basis. For New Zealand, to join the Socialist Equality Group, you can get in contact with us, Facebook, X, or above all, email us and let us know that you are interested. We can give you the statement of principles and begin to work through that process of joining the movement. And it's the same for the Socialist Equality Party here in Australia. If we move over one, you can submit an application to join at sep.org.au/join. So with those announcements, I'd like to thank our two speakers again, Tom and Oscar. Thank you for your attendance, your questions, your generous donations, and I very much once again encourage everybody to apply to join our movement. But thank you very much.